And again, the Lord God hath commanded that men should not murder, that they should not lie, that they should not steal, that they should not take the Lord of their God in vain. We sort of skipped on fucking 14-year-olds, though, that they should not envy, that they should not have malice, that they should not have contented one with another, that they should not commit whoredoms, and that they should do none of these things, for whoso doeth them shall perish, except for that one guy.
All of which they all did, right? Like
Right, Joseph hit all of these.
Literally, like I could spend an entire 2-hour block of this show just going one by one and providing citations of every single time Joseph Smith did one of those things.
Yeah.
So the next one is that they should not envy. This is kind of an interesting one because if we're like applying these commandments to Joseph Smith, he's somebody who was a very envious individual. When he was becoming a young...
Aren't there instances where he did in fact covet his neighbor's wife's ass?
I mean, we'll talk about that here in just a minute, but from a very early age, he was an envious person. I mean, we have the story of Sally, Sally Chase teaching him how to use a seer stone, and he borrowed her limestone or her lime green seer stone and used it. That helped him find a stone that was even better than hers, and that was the chocolate colored stone that we, showed a few episodes. So there are individual stories, but where Joseph Smith began paying attention to the market and paying attention to a job that he could possibly do was attending religious revivals. And these religious revivals in the 1800s are not too dissimilar from what a religious revival might be today, even though, today it might be held in like inside of a mega church or, a coliseum by 19th century standards and broadcasted on TV. Well, whereas these revival meetings were often held in large fields, they would oftentimes go for multiple days at a time. So Joseph would attend these religious revivals and he would watch the preachers and he would watch the way that they preach. He would watch the way that they would be orators, and he would pick up cues on who were the more successful ones and who weren't the more successful ones. And of course, as part of the circuit riding preachers, right? Especially when a popular one comes into town, he unloads from a carriage with his entourage. He's finely dressed, looks damn good, probably bathed, which was quite a luxury at the time. Smelled nice, and had a group of people with him that were his assistant pastors and whatnot. Then he would get up on the stand and may preach for half an hour, he might preach for 3 hours, and then at the end they would pass a collection plate around. And people would drop in anything from a shilling to a few dollars. And by the end, that collection plate is huge. And it all goes up to the preacher. And he puts all that money in his pocket. And then he hops in his carriage with his entourage and goes to the next town and does the same thing again. Now, for somebody who's Joseph Smith living in poverty, how fucking appealing is this? You go shovel dirt or, harvest grain or whatever, or you talk in front of a crowd for a couple of hours and they give you money. Which of these two paths are you going to choose?
They respect your uneducated opinion. You're making shit up the whole time.
Yeah.
And you're lying about it, which is the thing that confuses me. Why did he have to use her lime green stone to find that chocolate covered stone with the swirly in it? Did he actually? I mean, and then he had to steal the chocolate covered stone back from somebody else.
Yeah,
I don't know how they got it
from her brother,
apparently by legal means. And so he seems to really believe in the rocks.
Yeah,
because I mean, why wouldn't you just go grab it? Are there no special looking rocks anywhere?
This is, I think, a much deeper question about human psychology and the possibility of like a malevolent actor in these things, because what it looks like is that a lot of people believe that seer stones work, and that could be the product of some of the magic that they were implementing. And this is, some of my own personal research investigates the usage of psychedelics into the sacramental wine in the early church. But I believe that was a practice that was carried over from Joseph Smith's magical practices. And as part of some of these magical practices, the seer would have to become purified. They would do multiple days of fasting, or they would have to go through various purification rituals. And part of these purification rituals would often involve consuming a tincture of some kind. And that tincture could cause them to see all sorts of things inside of a hat that has a rock in it. And the rocks themselves would usually be blessed and anointed with some kind of a magic oil. So a little tiny bit of light gets in and their face is buried in the hat. They're high on psychedelics, and the glistening light from the oil on the stone can cause their mind. The sensory perception is obviously completely thrown out of balance with the psychedelics. It can cause their sensory perception to manufacture a visual hallucination of some kind.
Yeah.
So the extent to which,
on the one hand, I remember, I remember when I was a kid how bland all the food that my family always made was. So I can just imagine how much worse it was back in his day before we understood how to put spices on things.
right.
And the effect. If you add a bit of, well, you would never touch cayenne. Cayenne would be too much. If there'd be other spices that I don't think have a seasoning to them at all, but other people, I can't forget what they're called, but that other people, oh, that's too hot, I can't handle that. So I can just imagine what it would be like in the 19th century,
Right.
to have your sensibilities amplified a little bit. I also spent a little bit of time as a neo-pagan occultist, and I remember how people were teaching each other how to learn how to see just beyond what their eyes could see.
Okay.
Like when you're reading auras and stuff. So
yeah,
I can see how you could actually believe that you're really doing that. But on the other hand, he knew that he was lying about the feather and the box going down through the dirt.
Exactly. And that's the larger point that I'm driving at, is somebody who might be a truly malevolent actor, or at very best a self-serving actor, would understand that people genuinely believe in these seer stones, and they would then leverage that belief to say that, oh, not only do I believe that as well, but I am chosen above and beyond you. I believe it more than you. And in the case of Sally Chase, her having the green seer stone that she used, it was, Joseph Smith who said, well, I saw the seer stone that is more powerful than this one using your seer stone. Not only did he believe in the seer stones the way that she did, but he is chosen. He gets a super special seer stone that she can't question. Right. So it does come from a deep level of insecurity and wanting to be seen as bigger and better than everybody else.
I could just imagine how he felt finding a stone that had a swirly on it. Oh, my, that's a magic rock right there, boy.
I mean, imagine if he found some like bismuth or some like really like legitimately cool minerals, and bismuth is like angular and square and it's like rainbow colored. It's fucking cool stone. Imagine if he found one of those, right? Like they would think that these are superpowers.
Yeah, well, I remember at about that time, there was this woman who found a really neat rock that if she could take people into like a dark room and show them that it would glow in the dark. She became quite famous for that before she died of radiation poisoning.
Yeah, weird. Weird how that works. It's magic. I'm dead.
Yeah, I imagine that seer stone would have helped him out quite a bit.
Yeah. And turns out late stages of brain cancer can cause you to see all sorts of angels and shit. So, I mean, this is kind of one of the earliest things of Joseph that exhibits his envy, is him attending preaching these revivals, him seeing the tools of the trade that these men were using. I say men because it still is a male-dominated market. He was seeing them, and he believed that he could do it better. And he eventually proved almost all of them or himself right in almost all of these instances. these circuit rider preachers, they may gain some notoriety for a brief period of time, but rarely did they ever have more than a couple of hundred followers. Some, like Alexander Campbell, ended up having thousands of followers who were distributed over a very large area, but those followers didn't listen to him as if he was the mouthpiece of God. They just maybe attended the congregation when one of the Campbells would come into town, and they would buy the annual subscription to the paper that the Campbells produced. With Joseph Smith, the Mormons uprooted. They moved their entire lives. They gave everything to the church. So Joseph was able to see these men and say, what they are doing, I can do it better. And at the end of the day, he was better than most of them.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I've seen personal experience, people in my own family, they don't understand that the 10% was supposed to be net. No, they would give 10% gross, and that'd be the minimum. Because when things got desperate, they would give more money for blessings until they had no money left and no blessings.
It's a very common teaching. Tithing makes its way into most Sunday school lessons, most Sunday talks, most general conferences. Tithing is very commonly known as one of the most foundational and important commandments, and it is a commandment. And the leadership has gone so far to say on numerous occasions, nearly every 6 months in general conference, that if you can't afford food, if you can't afford to take your kids to school, if you can't afford these things, just pay your tithing and the Lord will bless you.
Yeah, so they're just telling me all of the priorities, fuck them. Give me your money.
Yep. The church needs your money. The 12-figure investment fund needs your money, widow.
Yeah.
It's great. No, it's great. It's awesome.
They didn't have Social Security back then.
No. Well, and the church has its own financial assistance program, but you have to be a member to partake of it, right? So, and there are a lot more people who are paying into the Bishop Storehouse system than there are people taking out of it. So,
Yeah. And I've seen how that works too. How when my mother was in a desperate period, and I took her to one of these places, and they give her the little bag of groceries, whatever.
Yeah.
So I've seen that implemented, and I thought at first, well, that's not a bad deal, because really it's not. If you're absolutely desperate and you're part of the church, well then they can help out the little old granny ladies that way.
Yeah.
But then, like you said, you look at the disproportion. The Mormon Church was it was a story like 2 days ago. I'm sure you saw it, where it was shows that the Mormon Church was hiding $32 billion in like bogus companies or something. Did you see this?
Shell companies.
Shell companies. Yeah, $32 billion.
And that 32 billion, I am almost disappointed that is the number that's getting traction, because that 32 billion is one tiny piece of the entire portfolio of the church. That 32 billion doesn't even account for like their land holdings. And their land holdings in temples and in for-profit investments, in malls, in all sorts of commercial ventures, total way, way, way more than just $30-something billion. Their investment funds total into the hundreds of billions of dollars. So that 32 billion, everybody's like, oh my God, that's a huge number. And yes, it is. But that number is essentially one account of many, many, many accounts within the Ensign Peak Advisors entire umbrella company. And I did an entire Mormon Money series on Glassbox Podcast back when the original whistleblower complaint came out for $124 billion at the end of 2019, I believe it was. And given the newest revelations, we're going to be doing another update on the Mormon Money series, because there's a lot to talk about. It's a fascinating story. A resource if people want to know more about the church finances, go to D. Michael Quinn's Mormon Hierarchy, Wealth and Corporate Power. It's the third book in his series of Mormon hierarchy series, and it goes through essentially the corporate portfolio of the church. And nobody has done as total of a view of an overview of church finances as D. Michael Quinn did when he published that. I think that was the last book before he passed away. In any case,
that amount that you said there was the bigger amount that they had,
124 billion.
124 billion.
Yeah.
So with this 32, let's be conservative, say 150 billion dollars so far.
Yeah, that we have hard record of. But it's a church, and churches don't have to file a whole lot of paperwork that other nonprofits do that would give us a realistic assessment of how dense this portfolio really is. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. So if we want to bring this back to the idea of envy, look, Mormonism has always envied Catholicism for its organization, for its ability to conduct inquisitions and cleansings, for its totalitarian control through what are referred to as the Dark Ages or the Medieval Ages, and the overwhelming power of the Roman Catholic Church, and for its wealth. And the church now, the Mormon Church, in just probably the past 4 to 5 decades, has now become more wealthy than the Catholic Church. So envy drives innovation, I guess, in this fascinating instance.
Yeah, and aren't all these people, I mean, they're diehard capitalists as well. I mean, I would have thought that, thou shalt covet thy neighbor because it drives the economy.
Yeah, and that's what happens when you have a church that is led by businessmen, by vice presidents of companies, by somebody who was a Utah Supreme Court justice. It is a corporate church that acts as a corporate entity. There is no theologian in the Quorum of Apostles. There is nobody who writes groundbreaking Mormon theology as an authority of the church. The general authorities of the church don't make any declarative statements about Mormon theology. They make policy adjustments because they're corporate. They're businessmen. They're all businessmen. They are all classically trained businessmen. So in any case, when we bring this back into the age of Joseph Smith, he also recognized his market competitors, and there were some powerful market competitors at the time. The Campbells were one of the market competitors. It was much more on Sidney Rigdon because
and realize that I, while I was technically Mormon being baptized, I know nothing about background of Mormon history. I'm sure there's other people that are watching that have no idea who these people are, so you're gonna have to give some kind of brief introduction.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the William Miller. William Miller is somebody who was an apocalyptic preacher at the time, and he was somebody like Harold Camping, who predicted an exact date for the end of the world. That was in 1844. And then that didn't end up happening. And then he predicted, it was actually later on in the year in 1844. He was one of the guys who did all of the math in the Bible and figured out how many days it is or years from whenever God said whatever. He figured out mathematically using the Judean calendars how the day that the world would end. And the second date that he said also Jesus didn't come. So he finally said, I'm sorry, it was not actually 1844. It was between 1844 and 45. And the end of 1845 came around.
Never admitting when you're wrong.
That's right. The end of 1845 came around, and it didn't happen again, but it did coincide with something that people saw as a sign from God, and that was a comet. A comet passed through, not our atmosphere, but a comet passed through and was visible in the night sky, and people saw that as the sign of the second coming, and that's what William Miller used to say or coincide with his Bible math that the world is going to end when this comet comes. So the world didn't end, and the Millerites believed that there was some form of an actual war that happened in the eternities or something to that effect. They just removed the second coming. It didn't actually happen. It was more like a spiritual rapture, a spiritual second coming, as often happens with these apocalyptic cults.
When Harold Camping said that the world ended spiritually.
Yeah, exact same situation. So William Miller was also quite popular because people like the end of the world. I think we discussed this in one of the episodes, but like people are fascinated. It's like red meat to dogs. The idea that the world is going to end, that all of the unbelievers will be burned, and that their beliefs will be proven right at the end of it all. And it's a powerful anti-human belief, but it's also something that's very appealing to people who look for simple solutions to complex problems. And the Millerites were those people. It was an apocalyptic cult, and Joseph Smith recognized that William Miller was a market competitor and actually spoke out against William Miller because he was somebody who well, he had thousands of followers just like Joseph Smith did. He was an apocalyptic preacher just like Joseph Smith was. But Joseph had the trump card on all of these, almost all these men, because he claimed to be the mouthpiece of God. He gave revelations that said, "Thus saith the Lord." So he always had something in his back pocket that he could pull out and say, well, you may be a preacher, but I speak for God, because he's always better than everybody else. So in that vein, there were also people who did actually claim to be the mouthpieces of God. And one of these people is Joanna Southcott. And Joanna Southcott, beginning in 1812, wrote something like 60 books of revelations. And these revelations are in the form of poems. They're in the form of "Thus saith the Lord," just like Joseph Smith. Well, Joanna Southcott was a religious leader at the time and a woman. And she was writing as the mouthpiece of God. And that was unacceptable to Joseph Smith. And he actually spoke out against Joanna Southcott. And if you don't mind, Joseph Smith actually spoke to the Women's Society in the Mormon Church in Nauvoo. This is known as the Relief Society. We'll talk about that more in a second. Because they were wondering, he designated them as priestesses or prophetesses. And Joanna Southcott was somebody who was regarded as a well-known public figure who was a prophetess or a priestess. And Joseph Smith just wanted to make sure that he could put the Mormon women in their place so that they wouldn't threaten his authority. And he did so by using Joanna Southcott as a whipping girl for this example. So that informs the context of when he gave this speech to the Relief Society. So, Aaron, if you don't mind reading for us.
This?
Yeah.
So this is Joseph Smith speaking to the Relief Society.
That's correct.
Okay. Joanna Southcott professed to be a prophetess and wrote a book of prophecies in 1804. She became the founder of a people that are now extant. She was to bring forth in a place appointed a son that was to be the Messiah, which thing has failed. Independent of this, however, where do we read of a woman that was the founder of a church in the Word of God? Paul told the women of his day to keep silence in the church, and that if they wished to know anything, to ask their husbands at home. He would not suffer a woman to rule or to usurp authority in the church. But here we find a woman in the founder of the church, the revelator and guide, the Alpha and Omega, contrary to all acknowledged rule, principle, and order. I love that 19th century outrage.
All principle and order. A curly wig on, slamming a gavel. Yeah. So Joseph saw the rising, because this is predating the technical women's suffrage movement by barely 60 years at this point. The earliest days of the suffrage movement are beginning. There are these women's societies that are growing in popularity. There are these benevolence societies, education societies, polysophical societies, and groups where women would get together and they would instruct each other and they would help each other and they would teach each other. And that was a huge problem for the men, because women starting to organize starts to look like men losing control of the total power that they have. So Joseph Smith saw that, he was envious or jealous of his own power. So therefore he had to make sure that he put the Relief Society and the women preachers of the day in their place as below men, because Bible. Good story. Good stuff.
So you're saying he's envying the women?
Yes. He is envying the women because there is a slight possibility that one day in the amorphous future they might have some level of power over him instead of it being the other way
Oh, crap. And one day they might even get to vote.
around. Not in his lifetime, not if he has anything to say about it.
I find it remarkable that that was just 100 years ago. Just all over the entire course of human history, that we don't get to that until 100 years ago.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting, the legal situation of women at this time. There's a paper that was done, and this is going to come into play almost immediately because we're moving on to Joseph envying other men's wives right now. There was a paper that was done by John Dinger, and it was called I think the title of it is Sexual Slander and Polygamy in Nauvoo. And essentially, so John Dinger is somebody who is not a historian but is a lawyer by trade, or trained, in as a lawyer, and he went through what was known as sexual slander laws that were put in place at the time. And what sexual slander laws were crafted to do was to protect women from becoming from wearing the label of, the scarlet A on their chest, right? If a woman was labeled as an adulterer by somebody, then she was oftentimes cast aside from society. And this can happen for a lot of reasons. If a woman is pregnant out of wedlock, she was seen as a whore. If a woman was, was in her late 20s and never married, she was seen as a spinster, somebody who would be spinning threads their entire day. If women had this role that their value was so much based on their ability or their attachment to men. And the overall point that I'm getting to in this is that when the sexual slander laws were passed, they were to protect the women from being labeled and degraded by society by those labels. But the unfortunate effect that happened was it essentially made it so anybody who was bringing up an accusation of misconduct against men, that those men could claim that that person is committing a sexual slander infraction, and that came with an increased degree of fines and sentencing beyond just regular slander or libel. So if it was slander or libel that was related to sexual matters, then there were increased punishments for it. Essentially, I'm kind of taking a long time to say this, but what this resulted to is a bill that was passed to try and protect women from being degraded by society ended up protecting men as sexual predators. Imagine fucking that happening, right? So
I was just thinking, of course, this is well, never mind.
Yeah,
Just
so
the way that I mean, especially back then, but I mean,
Yeah.
still now.
The primary problem that we have with this, looking back into the historical record, is that means that people didn't keep or they specifically obscured information so that they didn't run afoul of sexual slander laws. So if somebody was going to expose Joseph Smith for polygamy, they had to remove names of people. They had to state things very carefully so as not to run against a possible sexual slander law. So a lot of the exposés that we have of polygamy, oftentimes when it prints the names of individuals, of women who were victimized by Mormon polygamy, it will just say by Miss empty line and a Miss empty line. And for historians, this sucks because we don't know the names. We can't know for sure who the names of these women are. we have some ideas in context clues and by, you know, where they are at the time and so on and so forth, but we don't oftentimes have the exact names of the individuals who were caught up in the polygamy, because these sexual slander laws were weaponized against people who were trying to expose high-powered people like Joseph Smith. And William Law is the quintessential example of this. This was William Law published the Nauvoo Expositor, and Joseph Smith saw it as a slander rag, as it was all libelous, it was all defamation, and he burned the printing press, and that led to him being assassinated in prison. But the Nauvoo Expositor had to deal with the issue of polygamy extremely delicately, and it couldn't say that Joseph Smith did X with Y woman, because that would run afoul of the sexual slander laws. So that's an overall takeaway in all of this. So when it comes to the issues with polygamy, we have to rely on a lot of inferences, and we have to rely on later reminiscences. We have to do a lot of extra balancing that we don't have to navigate with a lot of other topics in church history, because it's dealing with a subject of sensitive nature that was censored from the beginning, from the inception of these documents. But a couple of examples that we have of this is Joseph Smith sent men on missions and then ended up marrying their wives while they were gone, and, or, you know, engaging in a polygamous marriage with these women while their husbands were out on missions. And then when they would return from their missions, then he would reveal the new and everlasting covenant to the couple and say, oh, by the way, your wife is now also my wife. Great fun, right?
Your wife is now also my wife.
Yes.
So, okay, that was an aspect of Mormon polygamy that I didn't know about. Shared wives is a very rare thing.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, because there's a distinction of the sealing practices that are done in the Mormon culture, and from the Nauvoo era is when these distinctions were conceived, and then it's oftentimes implemented in fundamentalist religions today. They have a distinction between time and eternity. So in the Temple Covenant, when you command, or when you commit to be sealed to your spouse for time and eternity, time and all eternity, that is the marriage and the sealing covenant. That's the language that is essentially the binding spell of this sealing ordinance. Time meaning the time that you're alive, eternity meaning the afterlife. So we have, beginning in the Nauvoo tradition, the separation and distinction of time and all eternity, where men would be married to their wives for time, but then their wives would be sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity.
But it's in the afterlife. It doesn't exist, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
At least from my perspective. My grandmother, however, was rather desperate to get a divorce in her 70s.
Okay.
For the reason that she didn't want to be bound to my grandpa forever.
I'm sure it was easy for her to get a divorce in that situation.
Yeah, while they're still living together, because neither one of them have a place to go.
Right. Wow. Wow. So
in their 70s. Yeah.
In their 70s. So
I've just never seen anything functional in Mormonism. It's just dysfunctional is all I've ever seen.
It's dysfunctional if you try and put it into practice, but theoretically it's very functional. Hey, you get to enjoy your wife while you're here on Earth, but I get to enjoy her when I'm up in heaven ruling my planets. I'm sure that's great for her. I'm sure that's exactly what she wants.
How many shared husbands does she have?
I think there are only ever records of women having two concurrent living husbands. There were occasional times where a woman would become a widow and then marry a new husband, and then she would be sealed to that new husband for time when she had already been sealed to her previous husband for time. And she would, it creates a situation of like, wait, so which husband is she sealed to for time and all eternity? Which husband does she go to once she dies? And it's all comes down to, well, we just do the ordinances down here and we'll let God sort it out later.
Lazy.
It's easy. One of these women that we have unequivocal proof of is Miranda Nancy Johnson. She was married to Orson Hyde, who was an apostle, a very close confidant of Joseph Smith. Orson Hyde went to Jerusalem on a mission to dedicate the Holy Land and to proselytize as well. And when he came back from Jerusalem, he found out that Joseph Smith had sealed himself to Miranda Nancy Johnson and made her Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde Smith. And he was so distraught about it that he left a suicide note and went wandering off into the woods and was found a couple days later. He did not choose to end his own life. He was just on the brink of doing so because it was such a paradigm shifting situation and obviously such a complicated situation. He just got back from spending 2 years traveling the world being a salesman for the church, and he comes back and Joe's fucking his wife. Like, yeah, I can understand why that would put him into a deeply depressed state of mind. And, I talked about him and his story extensively on Naked Mormonism, of course. There's another individual who was Orson Pratt's wife, Sarah Pratt. And she, unfortunately, without going into too much detail, she became a woman who refused Joseph's advances and was also somebody who was actually friends with some of the church leaders. And because she refused Joe's advances, she then became the subject of a vicious character assassination campaign by Joseph Smith. And Sarah Pratt, is reviled in Mormon circles today because Joseph Smith's character assassination was so damned successful against her, when all that she did was say, no, Joseph Smith, I will not allow you to fuck me while my husband is out being a missionary for you. So that's a fun little story. Fun stuff.
Indeed.
The best
I think
example.
I've actually heard her name in a derogatory way.
Yep.
I can't be sure because it was a long time ago if I did, but it just seems familiar.
I'd be willing to bet that anybody who has ever wondered or looked up the names of enemies of the church, Sarah Pratt's name has come up. John C. Bennett's name has come up. Sarah Pratt's name has come up. And she lived in Utah. She moved out to Utah with her husband as a non-believing person and lived in Utah from the 1850s until her death in the 1890s or something as a non-Mormon, which is, I cannot imagine how fucking hard her life was. In any case, another great example we have of this is Violet or Velate Kimball and Heber Kimball, who were Joseph Smith's close confidants, good friends. And Joseph Smith told Heber and Violet one day that the Lord has commanded a new and everlasting covenant. This is plural marriage. And the Lord has commanded you, Heber, to give your wife, Violet, to me, to be married to me. And I want you to go home and think about it. So Heber and Violet went home.
God never tells you to do something you don't want to do. I mean, God tells you to tell other people things that they don't want to do, but God never tells you. You never go around. The prophet never goes around and says, well, I really wanted this, but God told me that I had to give it up, much as I wanted it. Breaks my heart, but hey, God's making me give this thing up. But no, yeah. It's give me your shit. That's what God wants me to do.
It's always give me your shit. You have something I want. You have something God wants. You better do it.
Because God wants stuff.
That's right. So in this case, though, Violet and Heber went home and they talked it over for like 3 days. And then they finally came back to Joseph and said, okay, we agree. And Joseph pulled the classic old fast one on them and said, actually, God didn't command you to give Violet to me. He actually commanded you to give Helen to me. Helen being their 14-year-old daughter. And we have her perspective of the story. And if you don't mind reading a fairly long quote, because I don't want to take words out of Helen's mouth of what this was like for her. She was
Okay, so
14
I'm
at this
now
time.
reading. I am not going to attempt to do the voice of a 14-year-old girl, but that's
Thank
what
you.
I'm doing. It's Helen Mar Kimball Whitney,
That's correct.
autobiography from 1881.
And real quick, she's 14 at this time. Joseph Smith is 38 or 37 years old. Just to put this in context.
Gotcha. So, without any preliminaries, my father asked me if I would believe him if he told me that it was right for married men to take other wives. The first impulse was anger. My sensibilities were painfully touched. I felt such a sense of personal injury and displeasure, for to mention such a thing to me, I thought altogether unworthy of my father, and as quick as he spoke, I replied to him short and emphatically, no, I wouldn't. This was the first time that I ever openly manifested anger towards him. Then he commenced talking seriously and reasoned and explained the principle and why it was again to be established upon the earth. This had a similar effect to a sudden shock of a small earthquake. Then father asked me if I would be sealed to Joseph and left me to reflect upon it for the next 24 hours. I was skeptical. 1 minute believed, then doubted. I thought of the love and tenderness that he felt for his only daughter, and I knew that he would not cast her off, and this was the only convincing proof that I had of its being right. I knew that he loved me too well to teach me anything that was not strictly pure, virtuous, and exalting in its tendencies, and no one else could have influenced me at that time or brought me to accept of a doctrine so utterly repugnant and so contrary to all our former ideals and traditions. Having a great desire to be connected with the prophet Joseph, my father offered me to him. This I afterwards learned from the prophet's own mouth. My father had put one ewe lamb, but willingly laid her upon the altar. Yeah. I feel for her.
Yeah. I
What
can't
do you do
begin
with
to
that?
imagine
So
it.
when your dad sells you like cattle after your mom, because that's a whole other thing to think about.
Yeah.
And
And
I'm starting to not like Joseph so much.
just starting. Have you been here this whole time?
Okay, I don't have a comment on that. I'm going to trust that you do.
The story of Helen Mar Kimball, she is often held up as the youngest of Joseph Smith's teenage wives, and as the example.
Teenaged wives.
Yeah. He had there were a few of them. 8, 7 or 8 of them, I believe, were underage.
We've lost count of how many teenagers he was married to.
Well, it's not so much that we've lost count, is that we can't point to the exact moment when they started. It's just when they agreed to it versus when they were actually performed the ceremony of sealing, because oftentimes the dates are not exactly there.
That's another thing I've often brought up. The religious leaders, for whatever reason, always get, not only do they get treated with respect that they don't deserve. Well, not only do they get treated as if they are wise when clearly or they are not, they're always considered to be truthful and honorable, and they're given positions of political power and money and all the children they can fuck.
Yes. Pretty sweet gig, being a religious leader. Yeah. So Helen Mar Kimball is one of those really stark examples of like, this is unequivocally evil behavior. This is malevolent behavior. And I am more than happy to agree with that perspective. This is fucking wrong. This is fucking evil behavior. And most ex-Mormons who bring her name up don't understand the context of the way that she was coerced into polygamy. Because, yes, her becoming Joseph's consort at the age of 14 caused her untold suffering and anguish. But what we don't often talk about is that she so deeply and patently believed that Joseph Smith was a good man, that her father was a trustworthy person, and that her father would never, ever lead her astray. She implicitly trusted everything her father said, and she knew that if she were to be sealed to Joseph Smith, that she would be buying salvation for her entire family. And she knew that anything that her dad taught her with regards to the gospel had to be true, because it was her father, and he was also one of the highest leaders of the church. So in that view, she says, my father had but one ewe lamb and willingly laid her upon the altar. Heber and Violet Kimball did that so that they could purchase their exaltation from Joseph Smith.
Yeah, that one of the things I noticed about this tendency of the religion to do that, to buy salvation. That was going on in England once upon a time, way back before the Middle Ages. And the Vikings found out that these huge storehouses that these unarmed monks just have everybody's gold. And so they just tell you, hey, you buy your way into heaven. They would buy their way into heaven. And now they have these massive treasures until the Vikings show up, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Without like a whole lot of fear of that God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just funny how religion always does that. I mean, if you don't go back to like Exodus, I think it is, when moments ago Aaron was building a golden calf. Aaron,
Yeah.
the brother of Moses, is building the golden calf. Moses gets the command to kill every man and his brother, but he doesn't kill his own brother. His own brother, flip a couple of pages, is suddenly not only reinstated into the good side, but it now specifically talks about how to make his raiment and how to embroider the gold lame and the jewels into his robes.
It's like it's always about money and wealth.
Yep.
It always is, and it works. Well, look, and like I can't fault the followers for this. I fault the leaders for this, right? Because followers, like the followers are human, and humans want easy solutions. And if a religious leader says, hey, you can get to heaven by one simple trick, the people who believe that are going to do that one simple trick. So often that one simple trick is, oh, give God's messenger all your shit, or your family, or whatever, right? So people are going to fall into the path of least resistance. And if that least resistance means signing a piece of paper, bringing a chest of all their belongings and giving it away to know for a certainty that they're going to heaven, then it's profoundly lazy on that person's part, but it's also lauded as this great sacrifice. You sacrificed for the Lord. So it has this reinforcing nature that anytime they get any more wealth, they're going to still give it back to the church because they're so lauded for doing it, and they're purchasing their salvation. It's an easy solution to something that has no actual solution. We're simple fucking creatures. What can I say? Yeah. So, for more of
Pay now, buy later.
Yeah, right. So Helen Mar Kimball, as well as all of the stories of Joseph Smith's wives, read both In Sacred Loneliness as well as In Sacred Loneliness, the documents, and that's written by Todd Compton. That is essentially, it is a book that does a chapter by chapter biography of each of the women that Joseph Smith sealed himself to, and it just humanizes all of them. Instead of them just being a name and an age and a date when they were married to Joseph, he builds out a biography of each of these individuals. And In Sacred Loneliness is kind of known as the standard work of polygamy in the Mormon history community. So one more point on envy. Joseph Smith envied the president of the United States. And he actually went and met with Martin Van Buren when the Mormons had been aggressively kicked out of Missouri and they settled as refugees in Illinois. Joseph Smith applied to the federal government for redress, which was basically like, hey, the Missourians stole all of our shit. Can you give us a $1.2 million in payment back for all of the pain and suffering that Missouri, caused us? And Joseph Smith met with President Martin Van Buren, and Martin Van Buren said, I can't do anything for you without coming into conflict of the whole state of Missouri. So he couldn't help Joseph. He couldn't write a check for $1.2 million that is cashable to the Mormons. And Joseph Smith, after that meeting, called him a fop or a fool, called him all sorts of names, and essentially declared at that point that he is going to be president of the United States. So not only did he want to run for POTUS, but he always had overthrow capabilities or tendencies, not capabilities. He always wanted to be the supreme ruler of the entire world, starting with America.
What a surprise. We haven't seen that tendency in other religious leaders.
Or in other political leaders, for that matter. So Joseph Smith stands alone.
Mode off. Okay.
So Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon in order to Christianize the Native Americans. The Native Americans, this was something that he and the religious leaders at the time recognized. The Native Americans were a huge untapped market for Christians. All of the Europeans that moved into America, they largely knew about Christianity, and most of them had some denomination that they labeled themselves as. But the Native Americans was a huge market, huge. And if enough natives would convert to one religion, then it was believed that this would have a cascading effect and then convert more and more and more and more of the natives. Joseph Smith knew this, and he wrote the Book of Mormon specifically to Christianize the Native Americans, and he sent the first missionaries to a Native American settlement in Missouri to try and begin converting them. And it says it right at the beginning of the introduction to the Book of Mormon. This is in the introduction that Joseph Smith himself wrote. I will quote for you to read it, Aaron. This is what the Book of Mormon it states its own purpose right here in the beginning of it. And this is in every Book of Mormon that has ever been printed.
So the Book of Mormon introduction includes the line, which is to show unto the remnant of the house of Israel what
Native
great
Americans.
things the Lord hath done for their fathers, and that they may know the covenants of the Lord, that they are not cast off forever, and also to the convincing of the Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself unto all nations.
Yeah, to convincing the remnant, convincing the Native Americans that Jesus is God, that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God. Remnant. Yeah, the remnant being part of the Book of Mormon mythology is the whole lost tribes of Israel. Yeah. Some of the lost tribes we're not in the Book of Ether yet. Some of the lost tribes become part of the Native American peoples, and the mythos of the Book of Mormon is that Joseph Smith is giving the Native Americans an Abrahamic history. And once they embrace that, then they will convert to Christianity, specifically to Joseph Smith's Christianity, and he will become the prophet of the Native Americans.
So there's been some discussion over whether Mormonism is Christianity or not. And I can say that, being raised in a mostly Mormon family, they think they're Christian.
Yep.
It is the Church of Jesus Christ.
Yep.
So that's kind of a giveaway that they think they're a Christian denomination. But then the people that are saying that they're not really Christians are likely also to say that the Jehovah's Witnesses are not really Christian, and that the Catholics are not really Christian. But if you're Protestant, if you're Baptist or something like that, and you say that the Catholics are not really Christian, then Christianity is no longer the world's dominant religion. Christianity would then be the fourth largest religion. Islam would be the dominant worldwide faith,
Right.
and then followed by Hinduism with 800 million people. And then the third largest religion would be Catholicism, which is still larger than like all the remaining denominations put together for Protestantism.
Right.
But I can't get Christians who make this claim. I can't get them to understand that you are usurping your own position by taking away, greater than, or the greater half of you, because it's
Right.
slightly more than half of all Christians are Catholics.
When you make Christianity an exclusionary system, or your version is the approved of the true Christianity, then you definitionally exclude everybody else. You are a religion of one in that case, right? So good for you. You're not a worldwide religion anymore. If everybody is not a real true Christian and you are, okay.
Well, that's what happens when you put a number of 144,000 on your church. That may have made sense when there was 11 of you.
Yeah, right. When that was aspirational, yeah, no, that makes sense. So back to the point here is that size matters. Joseph Smith knew that the size of his congregation matters. That's why he went into so much debt to build the Kirtland Temple, because a large temple gains social prestige. If he could convert enough Native Americans, then that could be reasonably confederated into a military force to overthrow the American government. He also did some proselytizing to freed slaves, and they were the largest potential energy that existed in America at the time. There had been a few slave uprisings that had happened in the 1830s, and Joseph Smith was highly aware of them. There was also the nullification crisis in 1836, I believe it was, in South Carolina, that many thought was going to be the catalyst that set off the Civil War, but it didn't. So freed slaves were also a huge block of people that could be confederated to overthrow the government. So Joseph Smith wanted those untapped populations to be in his control, but he worked really hard on getting the Native Americans. He didn't do a whole lot trying to appeal to the freed slaves, because Missouri had been so opposed to Mormon efforts to do those things. With all that said, by the time Joseph Smith gets late into his ministry, he meets with President Martin Van Buren and says, "Hey, I can do this now." And he puts out a bid for President of the United States for the election of 1844. At the same time, he organizes what's known as the Council of 50. And I can actually show the minute book for the Council of 50 here. Okay. So we have the actual Council of 50 minute book here. This book has a fascinating history with it, but here we go. Record of the Council of 50, Kingdom of God, 1844. This is written in the hand of William Clayton. And if we go to the entire transcript, and I want to point out, this is on the Joseph Smith papers. This is a church-run history archive, online archive. This is their church website. This is owned and run by the Mormon corporate church here. And it provides an editorial note, an introduction here for what the Council of 50 was. And then it has the entire type of the entire 300 some odd pages of the Council of 50 notes. Now, what's interesting is in the Council of 50 notes, Joseph Smith organized what would become the government once they successfully overthrew the American government. So he has his members of the Council of 50 draft their own constitution. He has them anoint him prophet, priest, and king over all of Israel. And that's the apocalyptic Israel, which is to say, once the entire earth becomes Israel, they anoint Joseph Smith as prophet, priest, and king over the entire earth. And they also organize Joseph Smith's presidential platform, write his campaign pamphlet, and go and travel far and wide to electioneer for Joseph Smith. So he not only saw the office of president of the United States as enviable, but he saw it as attainable and something that he took overt steps to accomplish. Now, there are a
By whatever
lot of...
means.
What was that?
By whatever means, whether it was going to be through an election or whether it was going to be a military takeover.
Exactly. And there's a lot of disagreement because this is something that is hotly debated in Mormon history circles. The true intent of the Council of 50 and the true intent of Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, because the two things are inextricably tied. Was he making an honest bid for president, or was he just running as president for the notoriety, for the headlines that would be written about the Mormon prophet running for POTUS that would then generate enough national interest in him that he could run as a, he loses the presidential campaign and then he could run as a counter populist movement to whoever did get elected. There's tremendous disagreement about what his true intent was with this, but the overall takeaway that basically any historian will agree with, and this is a believing BYU Mormon historians will agree with as well, the Council of 50 was to serve as the operating government of the kingdom of God, of Joseph Smith's theocracy. And when the Mormons went out to Utah, the Council of 50 was Brigham Young's government until they set up a territorial government that was staffed largely by members of the Council of 50. So the Council of 50 is Joseph Smith's theocratic government. And that is what the overall takeaway is. He envied the position of president and the power available to the president. I mean, Andrew Jackson was the first president that Joseph Smith was politically aware of, and he was a fucking monster. So he took cues from that person and their power and tendencies and said, I think I can do that only better. But he was assassinated during his presidential campaign. I believe he was the first presidential candidate who was assassinated during their campaign. So this is all speculative history of what would have happened if he was successful.
Now, are you saying that Joseph Smith was a presidential candidate when he was assassinated?
Correct. Yes, for 1844.
But was he not also in jail?
He was in jail. He was in jail for 5 days before he was assassinated. So he organized he declared his run for president in February of 1844. He organized the Council of 50 in March of 1844. And then the Laws, William and Jane Law, and a few other people organized a counter movement against Joseph Smith and wrote the Nauvoo Expositor and published it in June of 1844. He burned that printing press to the ground in late June, in early June, and then was was arrested in late June, and then was assassinated on June 27th. So a 6-month period here where Joseph Smith went from being declared and anointed as king of the world to being shot like a rat in a cage in a jail cell.
In the back, no less, as I understood it. Climbing out a window.
Climbing out a window. And I'm of the opinion that when he was when he hit the ground, he was not dead, and that they put him up against the well and gave him a military style firing squad execution at that point, because he was Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion. He was regarded, and most people referred to him as General Joseph Smith at this time. He was the leader of the largest and most powerful private militia in America, rivaling the size of basically any state militia that could be brought. He had between 3,500 and 5,000 fighting men ready to go at a moment's notice, and it was difficult for any state to muster an army of 3,000 men. Wow. So he was a fucking dangerous guy. That's envy for you.
Which kind of seems to lead into the next topic.
Yeah. Oh, yes. and really quickly, I do want to provide sources for the Council of 50. You can read Council of 50, a documentary history by Jedediah S. Rogers. That was the book that was published that tried its best to recreate the Council of 50 Minutes from what we had released to us before the church actually relented and released the Council of 50 Minutes. This document, this document that I showed a picture of, was suppressed for 160 years in church archives, and they finally released it in 2015, I think it was. It was known about. Historians have been calling for this to be released for at least 6 decades, and they finally just released it this last decade. In any case, yes,